Great, so that we don't forget that. So hi everyone who are online. We are just waiting a few minutes to start. We have some people arriving here in Washington Hall, and I will start soon. I hope you hear me well. Do not hesitate to say it if there is something wrong, if you don't hear or anything. Thanks, Paul. So I think you can start, yes. I think I'm also just make this smaller. Great. So thank you all for coming. I will present today not my work, but the work of hundreds of scientists who are reviewing the latest science on mitigation of climate change. So the people from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which I think most of you know as IPCC. First thing, a little disclaimer. So I'm not an IPCC author. There are like 200 on this one authors. I was involved in the reviewing process for the French government, but that's nothing because almost everybody can be an expert reviewer of the IPCC during this process. I have not read everything, of course, because it's almost 3,000 pages. You can ask questions, but I won't have all the answers, of course. But what I want to do with this presentation, I only have 45 minutes to present you this almost 3,000 pages, is that I want to give you an overview of what it's in the report so that you can search for it later. You can go into full details into some chapters and etc. This presentation is made for, it was something that I rearranged, but it was from a class from students. It was supposed to be like 2 hours. So I will go fast and I will pass some slides. You will see there are some focuses that are pretty subjective because it's my area of expertise and things I find interesting, but I will have to go fast on this. And I will focus on the key messages of the report. So these are what I call the big numbers of the IPCC's assessment report number 6. A little bit of background. So if you are not fully aware of this, so this is the 6th assessment report from the IPCC, which is supposed to inform the parties for the UNFCCC. So each assessment report was used to do something into the UNFCCC, like a big treaty as the Paris Agreement, or before that, the Kyoto Protocol, or this one, the 6th assessment report, is supposed to inform the parties for what we call the global stocktake, which is an update of the progression of the Paris Agreement, which is currently in the process, but it will be the main goal of the next COP in 2023. So here you can see the big numbers of working group number 1 on the science basics. Here, working group number 2 on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. We talked about it last spring. And today we are watching the key messages of working group number 3, which is dedicated to mitigation of climate change, with almost 300 authors from 65 countries. And more than 18,000 papers, which is, I think, the most important thing here. We can go into more details another time on the inequality in research in climate change. It's very interesting, but I don't have time for that today, unfortunately. But I put on some references, very interesting from Carbon Brief on that matter. Just a little bit of example on that. Some researchers are worried because the floods in Pakistan from this year, where they were having trouble to modelize it and to know that it was going to happen because the climate models are using are made in the north for the north, and they are not very good at simulating these kind of regions. So this is the kind of problem that, so it's not just a matter of being in a balance between south and north and women and men, it's also having very concrete impact on the field. So what has changed? So assessment report number 6 is coming this year, and the last one was in 2014. At that time, there was no Paris Agreement and not an update on the sustainable development goals, who were signed into 2015. So in this report, you have a lot of mentions of the Paris goals of 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, and of the links with the sustainable development goals in the report. So this is an overview on the figure of what it is in the report. You have, as always, in an IPCC assessment report, a big introduction chapter, which is very important because you have all the definitions and etc. After, you have the classical where we are, what is happening, and what is going to happen. So it's basically the trends of emissions and the projections of the scenarios for the future. And then the chapters 6 to 12 are sectoral chapters. So there is a chapter for everything, like energy, agriculture, cities, buildings, transport, industry. And the new thing in this report compared to the last one is a new chapter on demand for services and social aspects of mitigation, which was not there before. So it's because there is a lot of new research on that topic. And also a specific chapter on innovation, technology, and development and transfer. And that's it. And the last chapters are always something going on more on the political and governance side of things to link with sustainable development goals, etc. So now we have an overview of the whole report. And I will go so on the summary for policymakers. See if you know what it is. It's like the 30 pages summary of the whole report, which is approved by all the governments in the plenary session. So I have been involved into the second draft of this report, and the summary for policymakers hasn't changed that much, actually. What I could say is that sometimes there are criticism of the involvement of government on this thing. It's kind of true because the main scientific assessment cannot be changed by the countries. So the scientists have the last word on everything that is written there. But some countries are pushing to add things, remove things, etc. And what you finally have in the summary for policymakers is subject to discussion. And for example, I think the main thing that we can find in this summary, which has changed and is due to countries, is that every time you are having a sentence talking about fossil fuels emissions reduction, you will find a word just before this, which is unabated. It means that if you have fossil fuels emission who are abated with, like, for example, carbon capture and storage, it's another thing. It's not relevant to the sentence you are reading. It's something that most fossil fuels countries like Saudi Arabia pushed for, and the US too. So it's a detail, but it's something you have to be aware of when you are reading this summary for policymakers. I will go fast on the paragraphs because I know that it's kind of complicated in the presentation. This is just the first paragraph on the trends. I prefer the figure. So you can see that emissions are still rising, but what the summary is saying is that it's rising a little bit less quickly than in the first decade of the 21st century. So here, of course, you don't have the COVID effect because it's stopping to 2019 due to data and to the cutoff date of the IPCC's reports, because they are only assessing papers from a certain date. After, they have to work on the assessment itself. Basically, in 2020, we have, yeah, a drop, thanks. A drop of like 5 to 7% of emissions, of global emissions, and then it rised up in 2021, and it's going to, I think, be over 2019 this year, which is not a good news. So this is not really new. It's just an expansion of the figure which was in the previous report with like the 9 last years. So emissions have increased in all sectors, especially in urban areas. I really like the second paragraph here. I mean, I really like, it's a bit strange because they're mixing two different things, but it's the first time that inequalities are directly addressed in a summary for policymakers. By the sentence, the 10% of households with the highest per capita emissions contribute a disproportionately large share of global household greenhouse gases emissions. So this is, yeah, a pretty important thing. And the next sentence is in another topic, but it's also important. At least 18 countries have sustained greenhouse gases emission reduction for longer than 10 years. It means that they have a consumption-based reduction in emissions. And that's also a good sign, even if it has to be maintained for longer and has to be expanded to all the countries in order to follow like a 1.5 degree pathway. This is the same figure almost as the previous one, but with the division by regions. And at the bottom, I prefer these ones. You have on the left, the cumulative CO2 emissions. With the yellow part is the net CO2 emissions from land use change, and forestry. So this is new because before we didn't have much this kind of estimates, and it changed a little bit the ranking between countries. And on the right, it's the same, but with per capita. So not cumulative, and for 2019. So this helps you to have a clue of the inequality in emissions. A big thing that's maybe in France, people are not aware of this due to a lot of reasons, but there is a very interesting and positive trend in prices of low carbon technologies. And it's when they say have fallen continuously since 2010, that's new because in the previous report it was not assessed because it was out in 2014. But they advise that we have to do, as they say, tailored policies and comprehensive policies to avoid distributional, environmental, and social impacts, because you can't do low carbon transition as you want. It will have effects on the different populations and on the ecosystems. For example, the last sentence on digitalization, there is a lot of debates on digitalization, and they say that it can enable emission reductions, but it also can have adverse side effects unless appropriately governed. So, sorry. Yeah, so we had actually climate policies since the last assessment report. We had the Paris Agreement, we had the nationally determined contributions. So the how do you say, the trajectory of future emissions? Yeah, I will. I went fast because it's the same. Like these paragraphs are this basically. So this is the figure which is in the report. And I highlighted the fact that it says it's from NDCs announced prior to COP26 from last year. So it's not updated. It's just to show that the implemented policies at that time are in red. And you have the policy assessments for 2013 in the Paris Agreement here in these weird colors, who are a little bit slower, but they are pretty far from the trajectories to 1.5 and 2 degrees. Also, the difference between the different shades of like purple are the difference between NDCs on unconditional elements and conditional elements, which means one is including the financial transfer from the north to the south, basically, if I want to make this very short. I will show, I just put this figure on the left because it shows the big uncertainty around this kind of projections. On the left here, it's the current policies, and here it's the NDCs on different models. So it's a really hard exercise. And I think in the IPCC report, like they use, I think, one model I have to check, but the uncertainty is maybe not enough represented, in my opinion. And to show you something new, I put an update from the report from last week from the UNEP, so the emission gap report 2022. It's the same thing, but updated with all the NDCs which were updated in COP26 and a few other ones from last year, from the year just I think there was Australia especially, who made new pledges. So we still have, basically we still have big problem of a pledge gap. So we have to make more pledges to go to the 1.5 or 2 degree trajectories. We also have a finance gap to go from unconditional NDCs to conditional. And if you know an NDC from a developing country, you know that at least 3/4 of it are conditional to finance from the north. And we have an implementation gap, which is the difference between the current policies who are implemented and the NDCs. So it's like here, it's between the blue and the purple, orange or purple. And we also have to make the pledges for 2030 coherent with the 2050 pledges. So actually, you have a lot of countries who said, yeah, our NDC for 2030 is this level of emissions, and we are pledging for net zero in 2050. But it pushed the slopes after 2030, which is a big problem. That's the main problem of the actual pledges. So there is a lot of work. But in the meantime, you can see at the top that the 2010 policy scenario before the Paris Agreement was in another direction, going for like 4 or 5 degrees. And now the current policy scenarios, if the policies are working or the ones who are implemented, and if there is no turn back or something, it's going for almost 3 degrees, which is still pretty big.
Even this 2.8 degrees, isn't this very optimistic?
I don't know. I think it's coherent with the last evolutions. It's supposed like it's the UNEP report, so I didn't check in details on the assumptions, but in the EIA, International Energy Agency, last report, which is doing kind of the same exercise, they assume that like the Inflation Reduction Act was implemented in full and working, and it was around the same result. So it's assuming that actual politics are working, which is also a big assumption. And here they are saying 60% chance. It means that's due to the climate sensitivity, we have 60% chance in this trajectory to stay at 2.8. But there is also the big climate uncertainty, which would put this at more than 3 degrees.
And yeah, sorry, I haven't seen that. It's only in 2015.
So the temperature is for the end of the century. This is the emissions until 2050. And this is also another update, which is like because in the summary for policymakers, they are saying something about stranded assets on fossil fuels, and they are saying that the actual infrastructure of fossil fuels, if they are running for their scheduled lifetime, would exceed the cumulative CO2 emissions we can have in 1.5 degree pathways, and it's more or less close to the 2 degrees pathways. So it means that if we build more fossil fuels infrastructure, it will of course be more than 1.5 degree and maybe more than 2. And on the right, it's a figure of a recent assessment from scientists who are working for the IPCC, who made a new assessment of the carbon budget from the start of 2022, which is only 300 gigatons, because they changed a few things in the methodology. And that's bad news because it's less than what was assessed in the IPCC's report. So 300 gigatons for 1.5 degrees. I don't remember for which chances, 50% chances of 1.5. It's like 8 years of current emissions. So we have to bend that curve pretty fast. So it means also that everything is going on this decade on mitigation. I don't have the time to go on this, but it's kind of a similar thing we were talking about. So this was a sentence that made the headlines last spring when the report came out. You may have heard people saying we have only 3 years to solve climate change. Basically, that was the summary. It's because in the report, they were saying that the global greenhouse gas emissions are predicted to peak between 2020 and at the latest before 2025 in pathways for 1.5 degrees. I think on this, the IPCC is kind of guilty of the communication. It's because in climate models used to this kind of pathways are running by 5 years. So you don't have the detail of which year it is peaking. It's just you have a lot of different scenarios and all are peaking between 2020 and 2025, because when they run the models, it was already 2020. So it means that emissions have to peak now, basically, this sentence, if you really translate it for real. So, and after the BBC had to explain what was wrong, and yeah, that's it. That's enough. That's a joke I made for my students because I don't like people saying, yeah, you have to read the IPCC's report, because reading an IPCC report is reading this. Yeah, and you have footnotes and you go to the footnotes, and honestly, if you are not familiar with this kind of jargon, it's pretty hard. And also, there is still interesting things in it on a policy relevant level, because these numbers, especially the percents, are the ones who are used in climate negotiations. Here it's the reductions of emissions to 1.5 degree pathways compared to a certain level. And sorry, you have countries who are comparing the level of emissions to 2005, some to 1990, etc., etc. So this percentage are updates from the last special report, 1.5 degree from the IPCC, and they are used in climate governance. So they are important, but it's also very complicated to understand if you are not aware of all these kind of debates. I will go a little bit faster on scenarios because I think time is running. And in this report, there are a new set of scenarios which are called illustrative pathways. Sorry. Yeah, that's the hard part. I have to go very fast on something pretty complicated, as you can see. So you have in climate reports, we used to have 4 scenarios. That was a good time. It was very simple in the previous assessment. And then they made 5 socioeconomic scenarios, which they are combining with climate outcomes. They are using these scenarios, which are called the SSPs, for the one who knows, shared socioeconomic pathways, in working group number 1 and working group number 2 reports, because they are used to project the future of climate and project the future of climate impacts. But in these reports, that would be too easy. They are using another set of scenarios, which are mitigation scenarios. They have a database. I think I have the number somewhere. Yeah, so they have a database of scenarios. For these reports, they ran 3,000 scenarios. Some of them were what we call vetted, which means we are checking on their historical trajectories to see if it's relevant compared to observations. And after that, the IPCC classified 1,200 scenarios that we can use for policy relevant purpose. That it means that they are kind of realistic. And then they classified them into different level of warming. So that's the categories from C1 to C8, with C1 being below 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot, and C2 below 1.5 degrees with high overshoot. It means that you go over 1.5 and then you use a lot of negative emissions to go back to 1.5. So that's the main subtlety here. The rest is just you go for more and more temperature. And of these 1,200 scenarios, after the classifications and the emulation of future climates, they wanted to do a selection of a few main scenarios. So it's not scenarios from the database, it's like a mean of certain category of scenarios. And they made a current policy scenario, so at time of 2020, a moderate action scenario, which is actual NDCs from 2020 with some further strengthening. It's like the word of the report, so I can say more about this. And the others, so this is our illustrative pathways, and the others are illustrative mitigation pathways for assuming more efforts. And you have different categories of scenario, which is interesting because it shows you that you can go to 1.5 or 2 degrees in different ways. So you have a one which is called gradual strengthening of current policies, which is going to 2 or a little bit more than 2 degrees. You have one with a lot of negative emissions, one with a lot of renewables, one which is focusing on low demand, which means like a lot of demand side measures in added to renewables and etc. And one which is focusing on shifting pathways, which is like sustainable development. And you can after compare the trajectories of all these different scenarios. For example, it's pretty clear here. You have on the left side the greenhouse gases and the capture, and on the right side the energy. And yeah, of course, the negative emissions. Sorry, I'm lost. Yeah. Negative emissions is using a lot of what we call bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. The low demand is using less energy in general, which is, I think, what I found interesting in the right side. Between, you can see that low demand and sustainable pathways are way less in terms of energy use compared to a negative scenario. And here, I think the 3 there, renewables, low demand, SP, are 1.5 with no overshoot. When this one, the negative one, is a 1.5 degree with overshoot. And I think this one is a 2 degree scenario or a little bit more. And these ones are around 2 degree to 3 degree. We have this somewhere after. If you want, you can go in the report in chapter 3 and you can compare these scenarios to the SSP ones, and that's also pretty interesting. So you can see that the current policy are around a little bit over the SSP 4.5 for the ones who are familiar with this set of scenarios. That's the temperature outcomes represented that I was showing you earlier on the big table. So it's just, they took the 3,000, no, I think that the weighted, so the 1,200 scenarios, they categorized them into different climate outcomes. And on the right, they are comparing them, the range, to the SSPs and to the new scenarios selected. So it's not really important. You can go into detail later if you want to compare.
Can you just remind us what C8 is?
So C8, it's just the scenarios who are at the maximum of climate outcome. So it's really a categorization of climate outcomes. It doesn't say anything about what's behind. It's just a range of scenarios. Yeah. I don't really use the C1 to C8 thing. It's just interesting to if someone knows the categorization and it tells you this scenario is a C4. Yeah, it's just, that's the purpose of this categorization, basically. It's interesting, especially for the C1 and C2 categories. So you can know if your scenario is with overshoot or without overshoot. This, I put it because it's also a thing that is used in climate governance. It's when you want to have 1.5 degree, you have to go to net zero CO2, and the date is early 2050s. On the right, it's a box from COPS chapter box 3. I think it's chapter 3, I'm not sure. It's just showing the difference when you want to go to net zero, if you have different dates. So it's here. If you, the top left, if you go to net zero at 2050, 60, 70, it changed on the right, the temperature outcome. In the same time, if you want to go to 2050 at net zero and you can go to it in different ways, it's also changed the temperature outcome. And the last one is kind of the same thing. So all these paragraphs are explaining this, at which date we have to go to net zero. Yeah, I like the theory. We have to do rapid and deep, in most cases, immediate greenhouse gases emission reduction in all sectors. So I think that's not new for everyone here. And the main summary of the report is actually there. So we have to transition from fossil fuels without CCS, that's the thing that was added due to the remarks of some countries, to very low or zero carbon energy sources, such as renewables, or fossil fuels with CCS, demand side measures, and improving efficiency, reducing non-CO2 emissions, and deploying carbon dioxide removal. I will go to this, I think, in another paragraph. I will have to accelerate like on this. It's just a figure which is going into more details about the differences between these different set of new scenarios. As you can see here on the top left, it's the emissions, the sources and sinks of the different scenarios at the time of net zero. So you can see that you have some scenarios with a lot of negative emissions to counteract the effect of the rest of the emissions in like the negative scenario. In the low demand scenario, you have way less sinks working, so anthropic sinks, because you have less emissions, because you have less energy demand, but you have still in gray in all of them a lot of non-CO2 emissions, so methane and the other one, I don't remember in English, sorry. So yeah, and then you have all the paragraphs on sectoral issues. First one on energy, so we have to remove fossil fuels. Industrial sector, you can do a lot of things in industry actually. I won't go into details on that because I think I don't have the time actually. But you have a chapter on every sector. So here it's like just a paragraph trying to summarize a full chapter. Yeah, same here on urban areas. You have a full chapter on buildings. So it's 2 different chapters. If you want to read on this, there is a lot. Here's it's just the whole section on demand side, which is the new thing of this report. So they went into details. I think the main interesting thing here is that demand side mitigation it's a lot of different things actually. It can be sociocultural things like the diets into the food system. It also can be infrastructure use, and it can be dividing on the figure in 3 things: so social cultural factors, infrastructure use, and end-use technology adoption. The rest is more classical efficiency stuff from innovation. So they are explicitly saying that both are complementary, like we have to do both efficiency and in French, we call it sobriété. We would say sufficiency. I don't know for now, but in the report, they were at that time calling it demand side. The potential is pretty big, especially in some countries. I won't shame anybody. So, and it's also big in a lot of different sectors. Yeah, so they are putting the accent on renewables, electric vehicles also. Even if you are in a country with still highly with carbon electricity, it's still interesting, but you have to think a lot about how you will organize your transportation in the future. They are also speaking about hydrogen and how to use it in an interesting way, sustainable biofuels, etc. And every time they are talking about the potential and the potential side effects, which I think is very important for all these matters. Yeah, and also a big news on the C11, they are saying that carbon dioxide removal, which is something, I have a slide later, pretty big in terms of different techniques and measures. So it's everything that remove carbon from the atmosphere. It can be from natural solutions, it can be industrial, it can be in agriculture, it can be in buildings, etc. But they are saying that it's unavoidable if net zero CO2 or greenhouse gases emissions are to be achieved, because they don't see a way for our societies to be at zero emissions. So it will be net zero, which means you will have still emissions, and we have to compensate for this if we want to stabilize the climate.
But do they, for instance, consider the opportunity to use forests as natural wells as opposed to industry?
Ouais, plus fort.
Again, is asking if they are considering nature solutions or industrial solutions or both. And yeah, they are considering all of the different techniques and assessing each one to say, is it long-term storage or not? Is it reversible or not? What are the risks for everything? What are the side effects on like environment, water, land use, etc., resources, energy? Like direct carbon capture and storage is working well. It's storing carbon for millennia, which is good, but it's also super energy intensive. So yeah, they are saying that we need carbon dioxide removal, but they're also saying that, you see, upscaling development of CDR depends on developing effective approaches to address feasibility and sustainability constraints, especially at large scale. I should have highlight that, because for sometimes, some of you know, we had some scenarios with a lot of negative emissions. We were absolutely, I think, not realistic. So that's a good thing too. And the new scenarios are a little bit less focused on negative emission, except one, which is its name, negative emission scenario. That's interesting. And then there is an assessment of a lot of different mitigations measures. So the figure on the right, it's a big figure, but it's interesting. You have energy measures, agriculture and forestry, and other land use measures, buildings, transport. And every time it's like on the right axis, it's the potential contribution to net emission reduction in gigatons. It shows that wind and solar energy have the best potential, and the color is the price. So depending on, there is a lot of uncertainty on most of them, but we have a lot of potential in a lot of different measures. Yeah. So that, yeah, I have a few focuses on these topics. I'm not sure I will have the time to explain. So geoengineering, the terms has disappeared from IPCC reports since Special Report 1.5 degree. Now they are just dividing between what we call carbon dioxide removal, which is a lot of different things, and solar radiation modification, which used to be solar radiation management, I think. And this is not even mentioned in this summary of policy because it's not even considered as something we should do, because the uncertainties are still way too big. But it's something we have to take care of, because some people are funding research groups to continue to research on that matter. And one day, if we are at 2.5 or 3 degrees, I think it's something that we will consider, of course, and even maybe before that. So this is a simplistic figure on how net zero is working between net zero CO2, net zero greenhouse gases emissions, the fossil fuel in gray, the others like methane in kind of orange, and at the bottom the removals, the natural kind of, and industrial in light green. And this is an overview of all the different carbon dioxide removal techniques and measures. You have the time scale of the storage, the different types of processes, and in the full box you have the different risks associated with every type of measure and the side effects. I'm arriving at the last sections of the reports. It's now the links with Sustainable Development Goals, and I advise you to go into more detail into this figure, which is the side effects or the potential co-benefits between a mitigation measure and all the development goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. So if it's a plus, it's positive, of course. If it's minus, it's negative. So depending on the measure, you have both, or sometimes one side effect or positive effects. There is also something on feasibility. So the IPCC is not assessing the plausibility of scenarios because it's impossible, and because it will be like une prophétie autorisatrice. What? Yeah, self-fulfilling prophecy to do that. So it will destroy the exercise of doing scenarios. So plausibility of scenarios is not assessed, but they are assessing the feasibility of measures. And for each scenario, you can see the feasibility of different kind of measures. So the like geo and biomass, technological, economic, social, cultural, institutional. Now you can see that some scenarios have less feasibility in one domain than others, and you can check if like the low demand scenario will have a lot of sociocultural, it will be harder on the sociocultural side. The negative emission scenario, it will be harder on the both institutional and technological, etc. So that's something I really push you to go and see in the report. These figures are not from the summary for policymakers. It's like you have to go into the full chapter. And I'm close to the end. This is on climate governance. So it's basically, it says that climate governance is working, which is pretty cool and good. And that's why we are not still on the business as usual trajectory like we were 10 or 15 years ago, but there is still a lot of work to do to include everyone, to do inclusive climate policies, to have, there is this paragraph on climate finance, which is absolutely not sufficient. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's the last section. And yeah, that's it. I will stop there for this part. I have a few other slides. Yeah, I'm close to the end. So, so they were talking, I was talking about the fact that we are not anymore on the business as usual trajectories. There is actually a box dedicated to these topics, which is explaining that the old RCP 8.5 scenario are now having like a low likelihood because we would think that it's not even a problem of resources, but there are already enough policies and the prices of renewables are already very low and they are less and less plausible. So people were studying in a few papers if we could still go as high as these scenarios in terms of coal emissions. Apparently it's not, but they are still worried about climate change, climate sensitivity, because you can reach a certain climate outcome at the end of the century, even if you are on a lower path of emissions, if the climate sensitivity is high. I don't know if that's clear, but if the climate, we have this big uncertainty at the end of the century, and if the climate is having a high sensitivity to emissions, it will be in the lower range, the higher range. And we still can reach like climate outcomes of these kind of scenarios with lower emission scenarios, and this is still a possibility. We also have the, of course, possibility of reaching tipping points, which is not a temperature issue, but more impact issue on local and regional side. That's it for this one. Yeah, I have a focus on the definition of net zero and net zero greenhouse gases and carbon neutrality. We'll keep that for later. And I think that my last slide, it's on decoupling. So there is a full section on decoupling emissions from economic growth. They basically say that it's a controversial topic. We are still having a lot of studies on the subject, but some of them are watching the past, and there is not a lot who are trying to see in the future what could happen on the decoupling. In my opinion, some people are watching very close timelines, like the last 10 or 15 years, and they are showing absolute decoupling on a few countries. The others are watching into the long term and saying that, you see, there is no absolute decoupling. And for now, nobody has really I think there is still a lot of debates to have on this topic. And I also think that focusing on decoupling is not really interesting because it's kind of a consequence more than a real factor that you try to change or something. So if we decarbonate our societies, even in the degrowth pathway, we would need to decouple. So it's not really, in my opinion, an interesting debate. Yeah, that's just a screen from the last slide of the press conference of the reports. Ending with this message. It's kind of, I put it there because it's kind of ironic for the people who are in climate change since a long time, because it seems like every year it's like the time for action is now. And also it's true. And it will still be now in 15 or 20 or 50 years because there still is space for more emissions. So that's it for me. I think I'm at the end. Yeah. And I'm right on time. Yeah, that's amazing. So if we have questions, we
can start with questions when people are online.
Yeah, if someone has question, we are hearing. I am.
So Sangarika is with us.
Yeah.
Namaste, Sangarika.
Namaste.
Maybe has particular questions online, you can open the floor to everyone who's here in person.
Yeah, I have a question. Do they say anything about hydrogen as part of the solution?
Yeah, that's really not my expertise, but they are assessing the potential of hydrogen. And from what I understood, it's mainly in big infrastructure stuff. Like we won't drive cars running on hydrogen, but for some specific usage, it will be useful. Yeah, especially as it's a vector more than an energy source.
As a storage of energy.
What? Sorry?
As a tool to store energy.
Yeah, store. Or, yeah.
They say something about green hydrogen, the way to produce hydrogen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the main problem with hydrogen now is actually if we decarbonize our electric system, and we should do it quickly, it can become something interesting in some specific usage. That's not an English word, I think.
Do they talk about the private sector and the mitigation efforts and lack of the private sector in mitigation efforts?
So I'm not sure they are aiming online. So you're asking if they are talking about the role of the private sector. Yes, a little bit, but it's kind of diffuse in all of the chapters because it's sectoral. So in every sector chapter, you have some details about how this the private sector in this precise sector can help share. But I'm honestly not an expert on this, so I can say more. My expertise on this is mainly on the scenarios, on the pathways. Yeah, and a few other topics that I'm interested in, like you saw, carbon capture and decoupling, and yeah.
They also talk about, we talked about that they have expertise on the scenarios. Do they talk about how they would affect the vulnerable countries, the very vulnerable countries, specifically with all these different scenarios?
Sorry, what? Which countries?
The vulnerable countries, like the island nations who would possibly get washed out in any of the scenarios. Do they have do they focus on that?
Not really done in this report because it's more the work of working group number 2, but it's also a very good question because we have this problem that in the models, the models who are doing like the kind of pathway we saw here, they are working on a cost effectiveness economic structure, and there is no explicit ways of how to say that, put the price on some countries or others. So they are assuming implicitly that actual inequality will continue in a certain way. That is a problem. And that is something that we want to work on also at the lab, because we need to have more explicit assumptions of climate justice into modeling, which is actually lacking a lot, yeah. So, but if you go into the report of working group number 2, you will have a lot of things on that, but not into scenarios and modeling. So unfortunately, as policymakers are listening more to nice figures with trajectories and numbers, a lot of people are more aware of this than of the conclusion of working group number 2, because it's like a bit boring to read these things, but we have a lot of data and of knowledge on this matter. But it's still hard to push it into climate governance. And I think you know it, but it will be like kind of the big topic of the new COP in Egypt, because all the South countries want to push the loss and damages. We'll see. Yeah, Simon.
I had a question which, if you already talked about it, I apologize in advance because I had to be out for half of the presentation. I had a question on both intra and interregional economic aspects of mitigation. Does the report go into depth into any substitution possibilities, you know, for trade, so trading more within region than between different blocks or different regions? And does the reports provide any insights into economic substitution within regions. So is it like specialized to different regions of the globe, or is it just giving more global global scenarios?
So if you talk about scenarios, I would say they are not going into that level of detail. The difference between what you are saying, like a world which is staying in globalization, accelerating it, and another one which will go back and do some more regional stuff. And this is the matrix of the SSP scenarios. And unfortunately, they are not really used in this report because they are doing their own big set of scenarios. And most of the scenarios they are using, which we can see on my screen right now, I think it's still shared. They are almost all into just two kinds of SSPs, which are the 1 and 2. And they are still in kind of a globalization world. And a world which will go back from this to a more regional one, but also with more oppositions between countries and regions will be the SSP3. And I don't know much mitigation scenarios in this one. What I know is that in this scenario, which is, yeah, it's one of the darkest scenario of the 5 SSPs. Yeah, you have it's called regional rivalry, the full title of the scenario. You have a lot of challenges in both adaptation and mitigation, because I think implicitly these models, and then the conclusion of the IPCC is that globalization is accelerating the diffusion of some technology like renewables. And I think these models are showing these challenges on mitigation due to this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does provide some insights. In the third scenario, just to clarify, are the authors talking about economic conflicts, and for instance barriers to trade, nationalism, and things like that, or I mean autarky and things like that, or are they talking about military conflicts? I mean, what's the conflict that they refer to?
The narrative is going on both. It's like section, region of the world and countries are more trying to work with themselves. So it's from what I remember, into the narrative, you have less trade and you have more risk of conflicts and you have less world governance. So in this scenario, the models are showing less economic growth because you have less trade, also more demographic evolution with more people, because the transition from like countries like regions like Asia and Africa is slower in this scenario. Yeah, that's from what I remember on this one. It's not a scenario we are checking for now, but it's something that could happen if we are going into a reversal of a lot of trends. And for example, in the climate change area, a lot of people thought about this scenario when Trump was elected and then Bolsonaro. And it's still something that could happen because we know here that Trump could come back. And we have also the big movement with the far right in Europe. So it's something we have to keep in mind here. And the other dark scenario from the SSP set is called inequality. It's another one which is projecting an augmentation, rise in inequality within country and between countries. So you have a global elite, and you have still a big working class overall, which is staying poor, basically. And these are all scenarios who the narratives are created without thinking to climate change. It's just possible futures. Yeah.
Two questions. I don't know, but I heard 10 years ago about the 441,000 initiative, California initiative. It's still in the pipe. It's still.
I don't know. I know the initiative, but it's been a while since.
Big noise at this time.
Yeah.
And now I don't know where this initiative is. And the second is, I'm sure it's not the objective and the role of the IPCC experts, but is there people trying to try and trade off between different scenarios to make it trade off in terms of feasibility? You explain that these scenarios, there's feasibilities for this 6, others for this one, it's more feasible.
Yeah.
Is that people's working on trying to mix and to combine scenarios for a trade-off in feasibility for every.
So they do it, I think on one slide I had some interesting figure on this. So for climate change, I think we need a lot of work now to expand this on the other environmental issues, especially with crosswork between IPBS and IPCC, because here it's like really how to implement, what's the feasibility of implementing these measures in terms of, yeah, so you have biomass, technological, economic, sociocultural, institutional, but it's in my opinion not enough, and we have to work more on like especially land use, because a lot of mitigation measure, especially on negative emissions, but also on reforestation, afforestation, are taking a lot of land. We have to see the potential problems with biodiversity, the food system, indigenous people, etc. And that's an ongoing work. We had the first workshop. That was the first workshop between IPBS and IPCC last year, I think, or the year before. So it's the beginning. It's not enough. It's going into the right direction, but it's like slow.
But are you able, does the report elaborate on sort of what role exactly it conceives for like carbon capture and geoengineering for those techniques?
So what your question is, does the report goes into detail in which kind of technique, or?
Yeah, and what role they can see for them? Is it sort of a last resort if we don't meet like the scenario we want, or?
Yeah, now unfortunately they are saying that we don't have choice. Like for every time they are thinking of the Paris Agreement objective, so all of the things they are reaching are in the context of the mandate, which is inform the parties in order to reach the Paris Agreement objective. So for 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, especially 1.5, we have to reach net zero, and they don't see a way in which we would go to zero. So they are saying that we have to do at least a little bit of carbon dioxide removals to be at net zero. But if you are going into the details, I'm starting to explain this to people because I think it's not clear. Net zero, it's like just a step. And after that, if you see all the scenarios who are, I'm here, but I could be there also. All the scenarios after sometimes, at least in CO2, they are like the rest of the century would be negative. So in that, for this, we have to do carbon dioxide removal. And the question is how much, basically. This is the difference between these scenarios, and with what. Like, do we put the focus on afforestation? It will take lands, on industrial measures, which will take energy resources, etc. Who will pay? Big question. Who will get money for that? Another question. And for this, the IPCC cannot answer because it's not their role and because we don't have enough data for now. Does that answer your question? That's a very big concern for me. But I don't talk a lot about this because there are not many people who are aware of this stuff except the modelers and a few people in climate governance. So last week was the week of the big reports because it's the COP this week. We had the adaptation gap report, the emission gap report, and from the UNEP. And some people just launched yesterday what they call the land gap report, which is a comparison of all the area which we needed in the pledges of the countries, and the results of adding everything was 1.2 billion hectares, I think. I don't say something stupid, but it was yesterday evening. I was tired, which is a lot. Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, right. No, yeah, it's very concerning. And in these NDCs, it's like just mainly afforestation. So half of it is interesting because it's restoration. That's a kind of okay. They're saying it's okay. The rest is afforestation, and that could impact indigenous people, the food system, biodiversity, depending on how it's done, etc. And this is just in the pledges and indices. In the scenarios, if you are taking like something like this, which is using a lot of bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, it means you have thousands and thousands of square kilometers areas with monocultures that after you burn into biomass power plants in order to capture CO2 and make energy. So yeah, I have a lot of concern about this.
And what about like geoengineering generally? Is that like aerosols and kind of those technologies?
Yeah, honestly, I'm a little bit not disappointed, but I would have let carbon dioxide removal into the geoengineering stuff, but I understand why the scientists now are making a distinction and not using any more geoengineering. But so the solar radiation management, it's assessed in the 2 other reports, actually. I think they are not even talking about it in this one, except to saying to people, go watch the others. In working group number 1, it's like what we know about the feasibility of this, it would work. Actually, we know it will work because the volcanoes are doing it every time there is an eruption. We just don't know exactly the precise mix of things we would put in the air, the number of planes, but the cost would be like in a few, maybe hundreds of billions per year. Like if you are not even a big country, you can do it. So there is a lot of matter of governance, of problems, matter of governance, like who do it, who is, when do we start, for how much we set the thermostat, what is happening if we stop, which is also one of the main problems. It's called the termination shock because you have a catch up of the climate in a few years. So yeah, this could happen in the future, honestly. Like there are people, very rich billionaires, who are funding climate research on this, which are called like Bill Gates and Bezos and stuff like that, I think. So yeah, that's a concern, but it's not explicitly in the summary for policymakers assessed because it's not even something like really on our considered in climate governance or in any country outside. It's just like start of field research. We're at the level we are right now. There are some researchers who tried to do field experiments. They were stopped by protesters, especially in Scandinavian country. I don't remember if it's Norway or Sweden. It was blocked by Sami people, so I think it was Sweden. What? Maybe. I'm not sure. I think it's Scandinavia, but it's one of the indigenous people from there. And they were the researchers wanted to do the experiment there, and they stopped them. So for now, there hasn't been a real field experiment like with balloons to check what mix of aerosols would work, etc. But we are pretty close to. If they want to do it, it would work. It will have effect on a lot of things like ecosystems and repartition of precipitations. But it would work like in a temperature. It would not stop acidification also.
Yeah. And so you're saying that the IPCC is engaging with those questions like about governance and like implications.
IPCC,
report, but generally.
yeah, IPCC is just a bunch of very, very good scientists who are very good at doing their work, which is answering a question. But the question is us, through our governments who are asking it. So, and also they are depending on the scientific literature. So if researchers are researching on solar geoengineering, if countries are considering it, there will be publications and there will be a place for it in the next IPCC report, but it's not their choice. Okay. But they are assessing the existing literature. It's more into the other reports on the effect on ecosystems, on populations, etc. I think it's time. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Everyone who was down 9.
Yes, thank you.